All right, this is a webinar, so your cameras and mics will be turned off. This event will last approximately an hour and be recorded and uploaded to our YouTube channel with our past events. In the fall, we are planning to move to a hybrid format that will still allow for virtual participation that we have been happy to build both in St. Louis and beyond these past 2 very challenging years. Unfortunately, our stalwart series moderator, Matthias Goeritz, professor of practicing comparative literature, could not be here tonight, so I'm filling in for him to introduce our distinguished guests. Each year, the Max Kade Center of Contemporary German Literature here at Washington University invites a distinguished writer to campus to teach an undergraduate seminar in contemporary German literature. Last year, we were fortunate to be able to do an event with visiting writer Esther Discherheit, and we are continuing to benefit from the presence of international writing from Germany on campus by doing an event with this year's distinguished visiting writer, Felicitas Hoppe. Felicitas Hoppe was born in Hameln, Germany, and is a writer based in Berlin and Valais, Switzerland. She has published numerous novels, short stories, children's and young adult books, and is also the German translator of Dr. Seuss's classic Green Eggs and Ham. Recent novels of hers include Pravda, eine amerikanische Reise, and Die Nibelungen, ein deutscher Stummfilm. Hoppe is a recipient of numerous awards and honors, including the very prestigious 2012 Georg Büchner Prize and the very first grand prize of the German Literature Fund in 2020. Tonight's event will focus on Hoppe's work, Prawda, eine amerikanische Reise, or Pravda, an American Trip, first published in 2018. Hoppe's books are called Romana, or novels, by her German publisher, but often defy this category, and Pravda is no exception. It takes as inspiration a travelogue by the Soviet writers and satirists Ilf and Petrov, who in 1935 took a trip to America on assignment for the infamous Soviet newspaper Pravda, which of course literally translates to truth, and Kurt and Felicitas will talk a little bit more about that, despite its reputation in the West for propaganda. Their editors expected of them to report critically on the unabashedly capitalist country that they were visiting, but the reports they wrote in the US overflow with irony, humor, and the unexpected. Felicitas Hoppe decided to follow in their footsteps, setting out in September 2015, exactly 80 years after Ilf and Petrov, and the resulting book is somewhere between a novel and a travelogue. Hoppe gave a talk at my previous place of work, the Goethe Institute in New York, while taking that trip that her novel would be based on in 2015. Now I'm pleased to have Hoppe revisit this finished work on her return to the United States in one of its greatest cities, St. Louis. Hoppe is to be joined by Kurt Beals, an associate professor of German and comparative literature here at Washington University in St. Louis. His book, Wireless Data, Telegraphic Poetics in the Avant-Garde, was published in 2019 by Northwestern University Press. He has published articles on authors including Georg Gross, Paul Celan, Regine Ullmann, and Max Spencer in journals including New German Critique, The German Quarterly, and Dada Surrealism. He is also co-editor of the volume Hans Richter's Rhythmus 21 Schlüsselfilm der Moderne. In addition, Beals has translated a wide range of works from German into English, including a volume of poetry by the contemporary German poet Anja Uttler, a collection of stories by the Swiss author Regine Ullmann, the volume Is That Kafka? 99 Finds by Rainer Stock, and Not a Novel by Jenny Eppenbach. We will start with a reading in the original German by Felicitas, followed by an English translation by Kade Derbyshire, read by Kurt Beals, and then a lively discussion on the novel will ensue. Thank you for joining us, and I'll pass the baton to Felicitas.
So thank you very much, Walter, and thank you, Kurt, for being with me here, and thank you for everybody who joins us tonight. And I just, I'm going to start with a very short reading and from the very beginning of the book. Wir sind hier doch nicht in Amerika. Schreiben Sie das in Ihre Notizbücher, Gentlemen, falls einer von uns tatsächlich noch einmal versuchen sollte, die Füße auf Ihren Schreibtisch zu legen. Nicht, dass wir das wollen, wir können nicht anders. Amerika ist nun mal das Land unserer Träume. Ein freies Land mit sehr freien Menschen, jeder sein eigener Sheriff, einsam, rauchend, ohne Manieren, mit einem eigenen Stern auf der Brust und einem Hut auf den Kopf, den er auch beim Essen nicht abnimmt. Und mit einem windigen Schreibtisch hinter der Schwingtür, auf dem bis heute, wenn der Mörder von hinten die Stube betritt, gestiefelt, gespornt, übereinander gekreuzt, unsere nach Westen gerichteten Fersen liegen. Wir sind einfach unsterblich. Schreiben Sie das in Ihre Notizbücher, Gentlemen, wir sind unsterblich. Und ergänzen Sie, damit hier keine Verwechslung aufkommt, dass ich bis heute kein Sheriff bin, keinen Schreibtisch, keinen Stern und kein Hobby habe, keine Kuh, keine Firma und Sporen schon gar nicht. Aber schreiben Sie auch, dass mein Vater aussah wie Karl May und dass meine Mutter die schwarzen Haare einer Indianerin trug. Zum Fasching ging sie mit Stirnband, als Squaw, mit Zöpfen bis auf die Hüften hinunter, eher als Orientale, mit aufgemaltem Schnurrbart und Fes. Sie reisten auf ihre eigene Art und auf eigene Kosten. Karl May konnte mein Vater auswendig, nur das Land der Seen seiner Träume hat er niemals gesehen. Was braucht ein Land, wer den Kosmos hat? Er ging barfuß von Schlesien nach Niedersachsen und wurde, was er immer schon war, Filmvorführer und Missionar in Gemeindehäusern und Kinozelten, wo man ausländische Namen bis heute so fröhlich mit deutscher Zunge ausspricht, wie sein Großvater, der Kirschner, der wirklich tatsächlich nach Amerika ging, denn seine Frau war am Eselsfieber erkrankt und glaubte fest ans Schlaraffenland, bis er im Angesicht unerfüllbarer Träume die schlesische Flinte ins amerikanische Korn warf, weil er an deutsche Sprichwörter glaubte. Er gab einfach auf, kehrte um und verstarb. Aber legt man erst einmal die Ketten ab, wozu haben wir schließlich Zähne und Zangen, dann fährt man ganz wie von selbst einfach weiter, was im Traum so leicht ist, wie durch Meere zu schwimmen. Die Jahreszeit spielt keine Rolle mehr. Was scheren den Flüchtling, den Schwimmer, die eisige Scholle, das Beringmeer, die Aleuten, Alaska? Am Ende, denn die Erde ist rund, kommen wir durch die Hintertür ins Land der Verheißung, ins freie Geschehen und stehen nicht mehr im Schnee, sondern unter der brennenden kalifornischen Sonne.
So I'll be reading several passages throughout the course of the evening. I'm starting with a brief foreword and then a passage from A Visit to Niagara Falls. 3668 Ilf Petrov is a minor planet discovered by the Soviet astronomer Lyudmila Grigorievna Karachkina and named after the writing duo Ilya Ilf and Yevgeny Petrov, who in the 30s of the slowly descending last century were sent by the Pravda newspaper to spend 4 months traveling the United States of America under the guidance of Mr. and Mrs. Tron, alias Adams, whose story cannot be told here, over 60 days and across tens of thousands of miles, from east to west and from southwest to east. After that, the two men boarded a ship, went back home, and wrote a book. This journey is dedicated to them. Then we have a time lapse. A day later, I was wrapped in a blue plastic bag at the foot of the thundering Niagara Falls, still hearing Walter's voice in my mind's ear. It floated audibly above the waters, effortlessly asserting itself not only against the roar and the cries of women and children, but even against the voice of my traveling companion, Miss Ann Adams, who stood unbendingly at the ship's rail and stoically recited the ballad of John Maynard, that staunch helmsman who held out until he reached the shores. He saved our lives, our noble king. He died for us. His praise we sing. For even the greatest helmsman of all time can't compete with Walter's voice, no more than the thousands of tons of water plunging, according to Ilf and Petrov, from the height of a skyscraper into the depths. Tamed nature, pure backdrop, fantastical scenery on a stage where the same play is acted out over and over 2 times an hour, with tourists as its protagonists, under the guiding hand of a director who does not wish to be named in the program. We're all in the same boat after all, and under the strict rule of free will, all pulling together from the captain down to the ticket collector. Masters and servants in one, we simply play along, playing ourselves at our own expense, each immersed in pure self-observation with our cameras until the short trip is over at last and we are released back into real life, to a living landscape of souvenir stalls and trash, the margins littered with blue plastic coats no one needs anymore. I was the only one who folded my blue bag with care and then stuffed it in my backpack for later, perhaps at the Pacific, while the others were busy stocking up on souvenirs, postcards, and keychains hung with tiny seals made of fake fur. But the show must go on, for it's only 2:30, so everything's still possible and doable before we head to a motel to freshen up in a pool so small one has to kill one's time in it standing up, until we're allowed to part ways one last time, to the restaurants of Niagara, or a brief visit to the House of Frankenstein. Above its entrance hangs resplendent a gigantic mask, and from its mouth issues the voice of the all-American monster. The fear starts here. It really does reside here, the petty tourist dirt cheap fear, directly at the entrance to the ghost train, on the thin line of dawn and dusk between Canada and the United States, guarded by 2 fire-breathing dragons, a vampire with double whitened fangs and a double Frankenstein, a long queue already forming behind him. The general public's desire for utter horror. Don't get me wrong, I love general public queues. I queue too, and have done for years. I too am one of those who go along for the ride, through a world full of overweight and underweight phenomena, besotted with the ridiculous blue raincoats and cheap umbrellas of their servants and bearers. I'm besotted with the mirrored sunglasses, with the scent of my bargain price sun cream, and the childlike laughter with which we board the pleasure ships that take us to the shores of democratically administered miracles of nature for a dearly paid for half hour. I adore the cheerful cries when the cold water comes down from above, wrapping our bodies in a mist that blurs us for a moment, mercifully. I really do love it, this human community for sale, its carefree intrusiveness on our brief joint journey through a world occupied all day long with making our true nature disappear. Not to mention our ghost, still speaking in Walter's voice at the entrance to Frankenstein's house, a voice intrusively carrying off the queue of waiting tourists into a warm world of artificial horror, behind which the real world may disappear at last, because we still dream of rescue and homecoming, of a rise that will never take place because we'll never understand that no one is interested in human destinies, not in the great land of visions and dreams. 3 cheers for all the world's tourists, always tortoise and hare rolled into one. As soon as I want to go from A to B to cast my gaze as undisturbed as possible upon the good, true, and beautiful, the others have always got there before me. I simply don't get it. I simply don't get there. I simply don't get through, neither to the good nor the true, to say nothing of the beautiful. They're always pushing in between their giant bellies, their half-open greedy mouths, their never-ending hunger for breaks and vacations that can't be sated with the best will in the world. No more can their longing to take part in a world that is constantly doing business with them, but never sharing the profits. For the true America belongs not to the masters of good taste, not to the pharaohs of yesteryear, and even less to the masters of true feeling, but to the auditors of interior progress who wear neither coats nor blue hoods, but slightly faded t-shirts, long since on the opposite shore, on the warmer side, on the Golden Coast where no one gets cold, while we're still at the Cavalier Motel Niagara, run for years by a tired Chinese couple who sweep the drive with a birch broom, lost in dreams, half asleep in the mornings, to get better Wi-Fi. So I wanted to start our conversation with the title of the book, Pravda, eine amerikanische Reise, Pravda, an American journey. And maybe it would even be useful to share the cover of the book. I think the cover also says a lot about what is inside in this case. And the title to me encapsulates very much of sort of the paradoxical premise of this book. We have Pravda, as Walter said, the title of a Soviet newspaper, which also means truth. And then we have an American journey. Can you talk about the tension between the title Pravda and the subtitle and how these 2 parts fit together?
Yes. First of all, thanks, Kurt, for the reading. It's fascinating to listen to my own text in English. It's so different. Yes, I was from the very beginning very attracted by the idea of giving my book the title Pravda, because I think it's it's a word that is interesting because it means truth, and truth is something that we cannot really grasp, not to mention the fact that in Russian there's 2 words for Pravda, or for the truth, Pravda and Istina, but since the newspaper is called Pravda, and so the whole idea, the whole book circles around the question, what is the truth, and how close do we get to what the truth might be while traveling? So the problem, what I think the essential problem of all travelogue is, what do we see and how do we go about what we see and how do we put it to words? Plus, it's very double-bind. Of course, it's a Russian title, and the subtitle is The American Journey. And I like that mixture because it reflects that I travel in the footsteps of two Soviet writers. And so sort of also trying to find out how true were they to what they saw. So to make it short, the whole project of Pravda started with a sort of a love story. I fell in love with the book of Ilf and Petrov. And from that very moment, after I had read it, I felt I want to redo that journey and following the various traces of Pravdas.
And they're not your only precursors in this book either. There are multiple references to various, especially European travelers who have set off across America. You discuss Tocqueville, you mentioned Karl May, whose journeys were of course more imagined than real, but who ultimately made it to America later in life. And I was wondering how these precursors informed your own journey. Obviously, you're literally following the trail that had been blazed by Ilf and Petrov. You're following their itinerary, visiting some of the same sites. When you decide to write a travelogue, often there's this sense of a sort of open-ended exploration, setting off into unknown territories, exploring and encountering things that maybe no one has ever encountered before. And in this case, you're encountering things that very clearly had been encountered before, and you're encountering them secondhand before you encounter them firsthand, which seems to me like a significant variation on the idea of a travelogue. So what led you to want to experience America through this kind of filter, through the guidance of an 80-year-old travelogue?
That's a very, very good point, because it goes straight to the poetics, or the way I go about literature. First of all, one thing I want to mention, I never, ever had the ambition, neither in writing nor in traveling, to be the first one. I think it's a very male thing. When I talk to colleagues who go for travelogues, you know, I generalize here, but I simplify, but many of them keep telling me that they still look for this place or space out there. You know, they're the first ones. What we read about the great explorers, he was the first one to set foot on but actually no one ever has been the first one, for the simple reason there's always somebody there before us. Even in the United States and America, we know that there is always somebody. The second thing is to look at things through the filter that you mentioned. That helps me a lot to keep a distance to what I do, and I strongly feel that writing and traveling, we always stand on the shoulders of giants. There were so many others before us, so I'm influenced by them, be it consciously, be it subconsciously. The text is always there. And to end on a happy note, when I travel, for me, it's always the first time. So perhaps I was the first one to travel, you know, in the footsteps of Ilf and Petrov. But these tools of reflection, with the help of text, of precursors, as you call them, for me is the most fruitful way to go about travelogues and literature. I think it's very good.
And I would say, as a reader, I also have the sense that that I'm experiencing what the travelogue relates in a different way than I would experience something that is framed in the sort of more archetypical travelogue genre that wants to present you with immediate experience. It wants to present you with sort of the first encounter. And reading this book, I was very much aware of the way that the trip is guided by the past rather than focused in the present. So it's not about the immediacy of the encounter. It's actually sort of about trying to access something that can't be accessed, a kind of reality that's no longer there. But this knowledge of the past then informs what present you encounter, and it informs your entire journey. So the trajectory that you follow is actually one that very few contemporary travelers through America, I think, would be tempted to follow, because it's really an 80-year-old trajectory. It leads to the sites that may have been more of interest to Soviet visitors 80 years ago than they would be to the average European tourist now. So in a sense, the entire structure of your trip is actually organized by the past rather than by the desire to encounter what is sort of the most relevant, the most current, the most contemporary.
Yeah, I think it's true, and perhaps it's not so true, because I think it's very enlightening to use the past, as a mirror for the present. And now throughout the trip, I was sitting in the back because I'm a very bad driver. So there were 4 of us in the car, so they had to do the driving pretty much, and I did the reading and sometimes read out from the book. And then it was just really striking how close the description was to what we saw outside. That is very true for the nature description, which points out that when nature comes into play, be it the desert, the stone desert, etc., then things do not change that fast. As for the cities, for the buildings, industrial and engineering things, there makes, of course, a difference. But I think it really helps. It really helps to modify the present the present development in that country, and perhaps it's much more helpful than to feel I have to be wie sagt man, wo der Puls der Zeit ist. I really have to
I have to be right in the middle of
right
things.
In the middle, yes. But I do, to be honest, I must admit one thing, it's very easy to travel in the footsteps of other people, and organization-wise, it was very easy. We just had to follow the book.
So it simplifies the planning.
It simplifies the planning, and that's part of the story as well.
So you're not distracted by fear of missing out or by wondering of what other paths you might
take. It's
really,
you got the point. It's really concentrating. It's concentrating because you sort of know what you have to do.
And so you think of it as a travelogue, or you describe it as a travelogue. Walter mentioned that that your publisher describes it as a novel, at least in some contexts, and critics seem to have been confused, puzzled, irritated, otherwise perplexed by the question of what genre a number of your books belong to. In one sense, this book is a travelogue. It describes the travels of a small group of people across the United States, through the perspective of a certain Frau Eckermann, who coincidentally shares a last name with the famous author of the Conversations with Goethe. And we encounter some verifiable information along the way, but in another sense, it's very different from what we might expect from a travelogue, in the sense that facts and truth are always fundamentally in question. Towards the beginning of the book, we encounter the sentence, Schriftsteller halten sich niemals an Fakten. So writers never stick to the facts. But it's not just a question of taking liberties. To get back to the title of the book, this is really a central question of the book itself. The title is less claiming that the book contains truth. It's not saying that this book is one in which you will find only truth. Rather, it seems to be one in which the truth is always in question. The book is sort of wrestling with the question of truth, or at least playing with the question of truth. We were talking about play earlier. Maybe that's a more important, more appropriate term in this case. How does Pravda come into question for you in this travelogue? What is the sort of problematic status that the truth takes on in the book for you?
I think you made a good point that looking for the truth is the main thing, and one thing comes into play. The problem is, once you start making a difference between the novel, the travelogue, the genre, you start having a problem. Now here we have partly it's journalism. It's referring back to Ilf and Petrov's book, but then there are dreaming scenes. There's an atmosphere of dream and half consciousness in the book as well. So you could as well talk about a novel. So I think the main thing is, and this is true for all my books, the reader has to accept that sort of construction and has to live with it, because I strongly believe that in the mixture of all these things, lies the truth. So this is a tool in the search of truth. And so I apply all kinds of different forms. And that's the way I try to go. There's definitely a certain playfulness in it, but playfulness in a very, very serious sense, because it's as funny as it might be, it's a serious book. Sometimes even a sad book, because the search for truth, I mean, it doesn't end in a happy way, so to speak. Yes.
And one of those elements of truth that is sort of repeatedly called into question here is das wahre Amerika, the true America. And this phrase, the first time I encountered the phrase in the book, I said, oh no, she can't possibly mean that, can she? And then, of course, over the course of the book, this phrase becomes recontextualized and more complicated. And you mentioned that this was even your adoption of a phrase that Ilf and Petrov themselves use with a certain irony or self-awareness. So it's in it's, even though it's not always literally in quotation marks, it is sort of in quotation marks throughout the book. I think that the true America is what is being sought, but remains out of reach, no matter how close you might get.
That's so important, because they from the very beginning in their book, they make fun of people telling them, well, you are in New York here, but New York, that's not the real, not the true America. And then they keep asking, where is it? Where is it? And they keep being pushed, and people keep telling, go further, further, further. And of course, you never find the true America. But I also speak from my own experience, because when I'm in readings in other countries, people keep telling me about, this is not the true St. Louis, this is not the true India, this is that. And then I keep asking back, where is it? Show it to me, show me. And so it's all about, again, Pravda, it's all about designing ideas, images, and it's all about manipulation. So we may not forget that Ilf and Petrov, they did not speak English. They did not have a driver's license. So they really depended on a guide with Mr. Trone, and he and his wife designed the whole tour. And so they crossed the country with them. And of course, this Mr. Trone had a clear idea what kind of country he wanted to present to these two Soviet writers. And he tried to avoid to show them certain things and push them to see others. And of course, they smelled that. And so they play with that, and they know what they get to see is only part of it. And we know that political propaganda has always been based on that. You invite a delegation to a foreign country, and you keep them out of certain neighborhoods and areas. And so you come up with a certain image of your country and of your culture.
So you said manipulation. I think mediation is another way we can frame it, that it's being mediated linguistically, it's being mediated through texts, through all of these narratives. And one thing I was just very aware of reading this book was how many narratives are being mediated through your book, that I'm getting not only Ilf and Petrov, I'm getting Tocqueville, I'm getting little bits of Mark Twain. And even Nibelungenlied surfaces here as in other writings of yours. So I had the sense that this book is not only sort of centered through an author and a journey, but it's also reading all sorts of texts and bringing those texts together in a new configuration as well.
Absolutely. I mean, we are surrounded by text. And of course, sometimes I feel, especially in this trip, I felt overwhelmed by what there is, not only in the past, but also in the present, because of course, then at a certain point, you reach a certain point, you can't do any more reading. And it was really funny because sitting in this car and being online all the time, which Ilf and Petrov definitely not were. I mean, they wrote letters every night to their wives back home. But we would open our computer in the motel and would receive, long lists of emails from friends that sort of followed the trip and wouldn't stop to give us recommendations of all sorts. So, tomorrow you will pass through, let's say, St. Louis or Las Vegas, then you must see the so-and-so movie. You should listen to the so-and-so song. So people kept telling us what they felt was the important part of where we passed through.
The real America.
The real America. And so you can't go to Las Vegas without having seen this or that. And I felt after, 2 or 3 weeks, I felt this strong burden on my shoulders, and I felt like I wanted to get offline because I did not know how to digest the information and how to handle it.
And you mentioned that your friends at home were following your trip. Maybe we should fill in our audience on how they were doing that. So there is a component before the book itself was published, a website for this trip itself. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that fit into the project?
Yeah, we just, we had a long discussion because we didn't know, once you start with a website, you have to feed it, otherwise it's meaning and senseless. So, but yeah, we had somebody design it, and we started with some basic information on who Ilf and Petrov were. There's also pictures of Ilf and Petrov. They took throughout that journey, they took 2,000 or 3,000 Polaroid pictures,
really?
Which was very unusual for that time.
Yeah.
And so these photographs still exist. And and then we invited, the users very much to follow us. And every evening we would add photographs, or we would add people on our guest list because we met people on the way. And so it was a work in progress and kept growing and growing and growing. And we also did it because we knew if we would not do it, we would lose lots of material and information and memory. So it was very, very hard, and we started hating it throughout the trip. But afterwards, till today, it's still online. We were very thankful that we did it, because it's a treasure. It's a real treasure.
And it also makes for an interesting kind of intertext to the novel, because some of what's on the website is then transformed in the novel. So we have the real life individuals on the website, we have their fictionalized versions in the novel. And so I think it gives you something to sort of go back and forth in between. So if you're trying to tease out this question of reality and imagination, it complicates it a little more, but it also might give you some sense of bearings to where the origins are of the ideas that developed into the book.
Yes, and I think it helps a lot, because my idea of what a book is changed quite a bit in the last couple of years. So I think the old idea now, this is a book and you should not need any other information, outside of the book or besides the book to understand what there is. I think our reading habits changed so much, and there's so much we're surrounded by. So when I read, of course, I Google, And it helps. And first, I think I always had the idea that people are sort of ashamed that they need other sources, or that they sort of try to not to admit that they turn to other sources. And I think it's perfectly fine. There's a book and there's some extra. And if you put it together, if you do not want to get on the website, fine, you can enjoy the book anyway.
It stands on its own.
Yeah, absolutely. But there is the possibility. I mean, you have the choice, and I think this is really how our world works. It's not all in one book. The book is part of the whole world.
Well, since we're talking about what is in the book, maybe I'll turn to the second segment of the reading, which also brings our attention to the book. Here we have a journey. The point in the journey here is at Detroit or Dearborn, Michigan, at the Ford factory. Write this too in your little notebook, that emigrated Europeans make poor tourists because they're constantly arguing with themselves beneath the burden of their education. Although by now we're headed inland for Detroit in a red Ford Explorer that will fly us to our next destination, into the heart of Henry Ford's workshop, a man who decided a century ago to make not only a few of us, but humankind as a whole, mobile and happily ever after. For the purpose of our labor, and I quote the master himself, is an automobile specially designed for everyday wear and tear, business, professional, and family use, an automobile which will attain a sufficient speed to satisfy the average person at an extremely reasonable price, which places it within the reach of many thousands. The master emphasizes the following points in particular. quality of the material, simplicity of construction, quality of the engine, reliability of the ignition, automatic oiling, simplicity and ease of control. For Mr. Ford believes in a different God, in a mobile God with no desk and no office. Mr. Ford is a free man, after all, with a calendar free from appointments, his head still held high in the billows of progress, a man one can never get hold of because he always enters the room from the back, which is why his business flourishes as if by magic through the pure presence of his absence. That's his secret, the tiny key to the controls of the great planetary transmission, with the prospect of domination and great profit. Never be where people expect you to be. Always be elsewhere. Always be busy. Always be ready for surprises, as though every day were else. For Henry is nothing but pure promise, never where the others look for him, a God who disguises himself from his worshippers while he builds tin Lizzies and risks his neck on weekends as a racing driver. After his battles are won, he plays the violin in the evenings and has a flourishing model village built, the likes of which the Soviet peasant improvers can only dream of to this day. Forests, fields, and clean rivers, air fresh as dew, contented cows and pardoned turkeys strolling through the front gardens of single-story houses in which a community gathers in the evenings, a community that no longer dreams of anything, not because it doesn't have the energy, but because everything is already in the right place, while the production rolls effortlessly on and leaves every vision of the future behind it. The capitalist as a storyteller, rural life with urban earnings, that was the master's motto. That car king and anti-Semite occupied for the rest of his time with bringing the world into line by means of his journalism, or by means of journalism. When the young Master Ford rode out to town in his little carriage, so they say back here in my Tocqueville Bay, he had his pockets full of bric-a-brac until he really, in actual fact, managed to construct a watch of his own at the age of 13. I'm going to spring ahead slightly. While Ilf and Petrov go on writing unmoved, commissioned by Pravda, the world now dreams of quite different things, not of light bulbs, but of databases that light up our interior veins, of a car that needs neither driver nor ruler, because it drives all on its own these days. No more fighting for places or power or the keys, neither Foma nor Ann Adams at the wheel. Becky has liberated herself from the flat cage on Foma's lap and is out and about on her own accord. She's in touch with the whole wide world, while we, back in my Tocqueville Bay, devote ourselves to the great thoughts of yesteryear, to the reading of books we haven't quite managed so far, as they're simply too thick. But as the car now drives all on its own, steered and commanded by a third party, we are at last on the right road to really, in actual fact, being free people and free readers, free from steering, braking, and accelerating. We are free and safe, with no duties or wants anymore. At a reliable average velocity of 65 American miles an hour, we ride off like Ivan the Fool on our fairy tale stoves, reading the world from back to front and conscientiously writing down everything that can be noted through the misty window of the Tocqueville Bay as we drive past timeless advertising slogans on offensive posters extending across the Midwestern landscape. I have the image very clearly in my mind, I have to say. The Midwest emerges in a very familiar way as I read this passage. But I was also struck by the fairy tales. So fairy tale stoves, but this isn't the only passage in the book where fairy tales come in. There's a passage in California, which of course is a land of imagination and the transformation of fairy tales into movies, where one character offers to tell a story to two others and asks if they would like to hear a fairy tale or a true story, so a Märchen or eine wahre Begebenheit. But then it turns out that it was a trick question because he was going to tell the same story in any case, and it's just a question of how they choose to understand it, how they choose to receive it. I was curious about the role that the fairy tale plays in your writing in general, but specifically with respect to America and to the journey in this book. Is there something specific about the fairy tale, even though it's the ones referenced here are European fairy tales, even though it's referring back to European forms and traditions, is there something about that fits the American context particularly well?
I think the fairy tale itself fits the context perfectly well in the sense that it said Kapitalist als Märchenerzähler Ford, and I think the most important point is that the fairy tale is not a fairy tale. And in German, we have this saying, erzähl mir doch keine Märchen. So, and this means don't tell lies.
In English, you could say stories.
Stories.
Telling stories could be lies as well.
And we'd rather say erzähl mir keine Märchen. And I think this is putting the fairy tale in a very bad and negative light, because I think the fairy tale is the nucleus of realistic literature. It comes from real life. It talks about people with problems, difficulties, about poor people, etc. And then it comes up with this kind of wishful thinking and tries to develop visions to escape from that situation, but in a very practical sense. It's not escapism, but it's trying to deal with real life by using a certain narrative. And everybody does that. The capitalist has his narrative. He creates sort of a utopia. And for me, of course, yeah, the United States, it's the American dream. It's a land that always, everybody can, make his Glück, as we say. And so I felt the fairy tale is the right genre, to use also in this book. And then there's one point, because of course, not only Ilf and Petrov, but all of us, we associate the United States, of course, with progress and technical progress and all these wonders of techniques, Silicon Valley, etc. And the technical devices we realize these days, they can all be found in the fairy tale. So there's, for example, there's a flying carpet. There is the Tischlein deck dich. I do not know in English.
The table that sets itself.
Yeah. It's like you only need to know, and this plays a very important role here, you need to know the password. And the password is something very familiar to us these days, but the password actually comes pretty much from the fairy tale, like also
the magic word.
It's the magic word. You have to know the magic word. And now we are the ones, to create our own password. And whenever I try to get in a digital mask, and I get the command, please create your password, I go like, oh, it's like it's like in a fairy tale. And if you lose it, if you forget it, you might get a problem. You try to create a new one.
That's a curse.
It's a curse.
A spell is cast on you.
And then, along with the fairy tale, there's another side, but this is rather, das heißt vergrößert.
Enlarged or...
Enlarged. I mean, the other side of the fairy tale is the icon. It lies in exaggeration. Like when we talk about Ford here and how Ford is presented in the Ford Museum and in the Ford factory, he appears as some sort of Superman or even a holy man. And in the museum, in the Ford Museum, you find a little Reagenzglas,
test tube.
Yes, which contains, it's said on this little note, that contains the last breath of Ford. So here you see, again, we talk about storytelling.
It really is like a saint in a Catholic church.
It's like a saint, it's like a legend. And it's and all these elements come together in a very obvious way in American or North American culture. I find that fascinating. There's heroism, and then there's this childishness. So it's very, very fascinating. And the book contains only a tiny little part of that.
But there really is an entire American iconography here, which interestingly is filtered through Ilf and Petrov. So we get an iconography that maybe would not be what someone creating their own itinerary today would think of. We have Edison, we have Henry Ford, of course. We do get a couple of contemporaries. We get Quentin Tarantino, we get the near contemporary Michael Jackson, who sort of blurs together with Peter Pan with his Neverland narrative that he created. We get Dr. Seuss as well, whose work I know you've translated. So again, the imaginative, childish side of American creative culture. And so all of these figures sort of become the characters, I think, in the American drama that that your narrator is experiencing, and we see them being part of this sort of cast that creates a fictional America, but where fiction is not an alternative to reality, but fiction is an integral part of reality. And that was one of the things that struck me reading this book, that the way that Märchen and other fictions become integrated into the reality is not an alternative. It's not that either you live in reality or you live in fantasy or you live in fairy tales, but rather that the reality that we live in is one that is shaped in fundamental ways by these fairy tales and by these narratives that have constructed our understanding of America that we live in.
I think that is so important, because it's not, our reality is not only shaped by that, it's partly created by that. It's all in one. And I always have had problems, with the idea of compartmentalizing. We put this here and we put this there. It goes together, and it's a creative source. And at the same time, the narrative and the fiction, you can't really cut one off from the other, it means creativity, but then on the other hand, it can turn out to be very destructive. And that's the other part of the thing. I mean, things seem to be playful or fairy tale-ish, etc., but behind. And there's one sentence, it only came to me when you were reading from the text, I had forgotten about that. There's one sentence that goes like a basso continuo through the whole book, and it's the one that starts at the Niagara Falls, with the Geisterbahn, where the mask is hanging, and you hear the voice, "The fear starts here." And this phrase is repeated over and over again. The fear starts here. So there is something dark, something dangerous, and something very destructive underlying the whole scenery, even if it seems to be playful. And I think this is a very, very important point in this book.
And I think knowing that this was a trip taken in 2015, you mentioned there's very little contemporary politics mentioned in the book, but there are occasional mentions of Obama and of the coming election. I felt unable to read the references to the coming elections separately from the fear starts here, from this sense, not just that might be an object of fear, but that fear is sort of suffusing the American culture that you represent in subtle ways, in some cases, in more outspoken ways in others. But there is this kind of underlying fear that crops up here and there, and that is informing the overall atmosphere of the America of 2015 that you're passing through.
Yeah, I think that's very important. And even I myself, I tend to forget that the trip took place in 2015. And then, of course, we were very much aware of the fact that the elections were coming up. We talked to people about it. People basically were not very interested, I have the habit, that I talk to pretty much everybody, and I asked somebody in the supermarket and she, at the cashier, and then she said, I said, who is the senator in this country or in this state? And then she said, I don't know, they come and go. And this phrase, I don't know, they come and go, that stayed with me for quite some time. And of course, we discussed with people about Trump, but nobody thought that was going to be possible. And yeah, the book, when the book was published, I mean, Trump was already president. So while I was writing the book, in the process of the book writing, he had become already president. So that definitely had an influence on the book, but I decided not to mention him in the book, because this would not have been true. Yeah, because he was not that present in 2015,
Yeah, and that's what I had to remind myself of, actually.
This is, like being, I was so, my vision, I already knew in 2015 what was coming up, and that's not true.
Yeah, and it's not a book about foreshadowing what is to come.
No.
There's one other scene that I wanted to talk about that I thought was one of the really beautiful passages in the book, which is near Death Valley, You describe a theater, and I, having lived in California for 5 years, I had never heard of this. I've even been to Death Valley. A theater called Cork Hill Hall, where a dancer, Martha Beckett, painted the walls to make this theater into sort of an opera house. And the narrator is looking at these paintings, reflecting that one of her companions, the one who is a professor, would see them as fakes, as forgeries. But then this artist, who is her companion for part of the way, comes up behind her and says, "Alles echt, sie sind da." So it's all real or authentic, they're there. And I'm tempted to see this kind of ekphrastic passage, the description of these paintings, these murals, as a commentary on what the book itself is trying to do. So it's representing a reality that is at once entirely imagined, entirely a facade of sorts, but also entirely real at the same time. Is that reading too much into it, or does that fit with your understanding of what the book is doing?
No, I think it perfectly fits in my understanding of the book. I think it's the essence, but then still it's not was heißt Fata Morgana? It's
a mirage.
Yeah, it's sie sind da. It's really there, and it points also to the individual strength of a person. And then we get back to the wishful thinking. Martha Beckett, she was a not very successful dancer, traveling with her husband through the States and trying to make some money, and ends up in this place and decides, I'm going to stay here. For me, this is such an American story. I mean, there's space and she does it, she goes for it, she creates this place and makes it a place of her own because she wants it to be her place. And that's a miracle in some ways, because this, for me as a European, this is what I really greatly admire about this country and this culture, this sort of self-invention that can end up in a very pathetic way, but in this case it worked out okay. But anyway, it's possible. And so this is what I try to focus on, on things that are rather on the side, it's magical. I mean, this place is a magic place. Martha Beckett died, I think, 2 years ago, but when we were there, she was still alive, but we didn't dare to knock at her door.
Well, having read about it, I looked it up. I looked at the images. I found an obituary for her, actually. Maybe the outcome of this travelogue will be that I then undertake my own journey in your footsteps, a pilgrimage to this Death Valley site, because it looks like a beautiful theater. So I would love to visit it one day. I see that our time is getting close to an end. So I'm going to read a bit more from the Henry Ford passage, and then I think you had a brief passage from the German.
Very brief,
a poem to read to bring us to a close. So we come back to Henry Ford. Oh yes, I'll admit, I was literally in the symphonic grip of that great story, for Mr. Ford likes to circulate, and I turn circles too. I too suddenly wanted to be great and progressive, possessed by a true vision that would make me a truly great artist one faraway day, no doubt about it, with a cow of my own, in a field of my own, in the boundless Midwest, with a firm of my own and a hobby that's all mine. I saw myself sitting at a flying golden desk, flanked by scores of conscientious bonded scriveners, all thinking, writing, and imagining for me around the clock and in changing shifts, inventing ever more stories that will make me immortal forever, because they stick to reliable poetological ground rules one can only learn in Europe. Quality of the material, simplicity of construction, quality of the engine, reliability of the ignition, automatic oiling, simplicity and ease of control of the planetary transmission, quality of the execution. While I was under the spell of imperial timbers and occupied with drawing up fantastical contracts complete with dizzying fees, the bus had long since reached its destination. The voice on the screen fell silent. We disembarked and found ourselves in a magnificent hall, only to become the tail of another snaking general public queue, its forked tongue politely asking us to pay up. The fear starts here. We paid up fearlessly without batting an eyelid before we were instantly pushed to the end of a second queue under the strict command of the attendants and guards, all of them black beneath bright orange t-shirts. This queue number 2 moved slowly but surely up an escalator to the next floor, where we were finally granted a first glance at our own at Henry Ford's famous workshop of the model conveyor belt on a model factory floor where nobody knows who's watching whom. Are the tourists eyeing the workers, or in actual fact, the weekend workers eyeing their Saturday tourists? From our bird's eye perspective, the work seemed simple, the workers calm and collected. Instead of gray overalls and masks of Dr. Brecht's theater, they wore cheerful everyday clothing, bright t-shirts and late summer pants. Now and then they'd stop and look up as though keeping a lookout for stars between 2 working procedures. Otherwise, nothing seemed to disturb them, least of all the streams of visitors, firmly convincing Foma that they were not workers but actors, merely playing the role of model workers. He was probably right. Presumably the whole thing was nothing but a project, a dress rehearsal for a sentimental paying audience. For who, if not Henry, the all-American monster who considered himself the inventor of the first pocket watch, would ever have thought of replacing unemployed workers from Detroit with unemployed actors from Hollywood, miming the simple man on the factory floor for the tourists of the world, acting out the little man before his lunch break who dreams of other bigger roles until finally the bell tolls and he can make a dash for the cafeteria.
So do we have enough time for the poem? Yes,
Yes, I think
so.
we have just enough time.
So time flies, and there's so much we still could talk about.
There's a lot in that novel.
No, thank you very much, Kurt, for getting really into the center of the book and asking so interesting questions. So, but to end on a happy note, and meanwhile it's getting dark or got dark outside, I just want to drop in a poem, because sometimes in the evening I was tired, I was frustrated, we had lots of conflicts on the journey, of course, and then I started writing poems just to comfort myself, and I tried to translate them into English. And besides the Dr. Seuss, I'm not a translator really, but so I will read one poem in German and in English that is dedicated to one motel that saved our lives one night, where we felt we wouldn't find a bed anymore. Regen, dunkel, nichts mehr los. Letzte Rettung, Bob und Rose. Sie, die bösen Geister, weichen im Motel zu den 2 Eichen, wo wir gleich in welchen Betten in den Schlaf der Nacht uns retten. Und auf Englisch: Rain, sheer darkness, nothing close. Who will save us, Bob and Rose? All bad spirits disappear, nothing anymore to fear. At Twin Oaks, the beds are cozy and the sleep is deep and rosy. Good night.
Right.
Thank you, Kurt and Felicitas. I just posted in the chat for those still here. There are a couple upcoming events that you may be interested in. If you are interested in this event, the German department is hosting a reading with Hengame Yagu Bifara, another German author, over Zoom on Friday. And then there will be a faculty book discussion that the libraries are hosting hybrid in Umrath and over Zoom next Wednesday. And I hope all of you will be able to attend those. And thank you for coming this evening. Thank you from the university libraries and from the Department of Comparative Literature and from Matthias Goeritz, who unfortunately couldn't be here tonight. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Walter.
Thank you.